Erev Tov. We've got two interesting questions I want to tackle tonight, so let's dive right in. Here's the first one. Why in the Siddur is God's name spelled differently? For example, it can be seen with two yuds or with four letters or Adonai spelled out. It all is pronounced the same way but spelled differently. Is there a reason for that? Also, if I made a copy of some prayers that has God's name in Hebrew on it, I no longer need it as I have the original in a Siddur. Can that piece of paper be discarded, or should it be treated more respectfully since it has God's name on it? Okay, so let's talk about the name of God. Originally, not only among Hebrews, but among the local people, Canaanites, God was known as El. El in English, Aleph Lamed, El, which basically means God. From there, you find a more sophisticated name. We use Elohim, which seems to be the plural form of El. Perhaps it was the Hebrews' way of indicating that our God encompasses all the other gods and all the other aspects of the gods that other people worshipped. So El and then Elohim. Another name that you find quite frequently is Shaddai. Hard to know exactly what Shaddai means. Perhaps it refers to the god of the mountains. Perhaps it's related to the Hebrew concept Shaddayim, meaning breasts, God as the ultimate mother or nurturer. Shaddai is often translated as Almighty, God Almighty. From there we find another possibility, Adonai Tzivaot. Adonai, same word as Adon, like in Adon Olam, Lord. So Adonai, my Lord, and Tzivaot. If you're familiar, the Hebrew word Tzava means army. So Adonai Tzivaot literally means God of armies. What armies are we talking about? Not human armies, but rather the host of stars and angels and other beings or creations that are in the sky. Adonai Tzivaot, the Lord of hosts, or the Lord of armies. So those are a number of the familiar names that you'll find in the Bible referring to God. But the ultimate name, and it's actually the name of God, is what we call in sophisticated biblical scholarship, we refer to as the Tetragrammaton. The Tetragrammaton meaning the four-letter name of God. And of course, what we're referring to is Yud-He, Vav-He, right? Those four letters. Now, this is important to understand because in English we sometimes miss this. God, G-O-D, that's not his name. That's his job. His name is those four letters, Yud-He, Vav-He. Now, what do those letters signify? What does that name mean? All names mean something. Why was God given that name? And what is he trying to convey to us by those four letters? Well, you may know from the prayer book, Hu Haya, Hu Hoveh, Hu Yihiyeh B'Tifara. The name of God, Yud-He, Vav-He, seems to be related to the Hebrew root Haya, or hoveh, or yihyeh. That's past, present, and future. Was, is, will be. And so the name of God, Yud-He Vav-He, seems to have something to do with was, is, will be. And perhaps that is a clue about the eternity of God. So the name, the four-letter name of God, signifies he always was here and he always will be here. You should know that others, biblical scholars, say the name of God, it has to do with I was the one who causes all things to be, right? Again, back to was, is, will be. I am the one who brought everyone into existence. So something, Yud-He Vav-He, the four-letter name of God, signifies God as the ultimate creator. There's a famous, in English, going back to King James, the idea was, I am that I am. And meaning when Moses said, who are you? Tell me your name. And God says, I am that I am, which seems to be an evasion. In other words, a human being can't understand who I am, what I am, and that's beyond you. And perhaps that's what God means when he refers to himself by this name. There's a beautiful interpretation by Rashi, again, from I was, I am, I will be, but with you. I've always I, God, have always been with you. I am with you now. I always will be with you. And this is the name that God reveals to Moses when Moses says to God, okay, it's at the burning bush, tell me who you are. When the people say, where is this God? What should we know about him? And the answer that Rashi's interpretation of God's answer is, God is with us. That's all the people need to know. They don't really care about he is the creator. What the people want to know is he going to be with us? Is he going to take care of us? Does he have our back, kind of thing. So that's as well. Yud-He, Vav-He, especially the first two letters, Yud-He, when you express them, it's Yah. And some biblical scholars say that ultimately this was an exclamation of people on earth referring to or calling to or thanking or praising God. They would simply look to the heavens and say, Yah, as a way of accessing or speaking to God. And Yud-He, Vav-He becomes a form of that. Doesn't necessarily have meaning. It's a primal call, a primal scream on the part of human beings. So this is what we know. God has many names, and you find many of these different names used in the Torah, throughout the Bible, and afterwards to give us different aspects of God. God the Almighty, or maybe God the nurturing mother, or according to the rabbis, when you use the word Elohim, we're speaking about the God of justice. When we use the name Yud-He, Vav-He, we're speaking about the God of mercy. Right? So that each name seems to convey a different aspect of God's personality. Later, in rabbinic times, meaning beginning with the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, we'll find that there are additional names or epithets that God has. You may be familiar with Hamakom, We use that phrase when we give a blessing to mourners. Hamakom yenachem etchem. May God comfort you. But the word itself, hamakom, makom means place. So it's a way of saying God is the omnipresent. God is in every place. Wherever you look, God is there. Which is maybe similar to what Rashi's understanding, I am with you, right? I'm always to be found. You're never going to have to search for me. I am everywhere. Wherever you are, I am. Rabbis also refer in the Talmud quite a bit to God as the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He. Or sometimes they refer to God as Rahmana, as the merciful one. So again, many, many different names of God. The mystics even speak about 70 different names that God has. But you know what? It ultimately all comes down to Yud-He, Vav-He, and Elohim. Now, Elohim is always translated as God, G-O-D, and Yud-He, Vav-He is always translated as Lord. Sometimes you will see it not translated at all, and you will see 4 letters, Y-H-V-H or Y-H-W-H. In other words, instead of trying to translate the name, we just give the letters. So in some, especially Orthodox translations, instead of saying Lord, it will simply say YHVH. Now, how are you supposed to pronounce that? Well, the point is you're not. And we'll get to that right now. So here was the thing. God's name, not God's job, G-O-D. Forget that. God's actual name, Yud-He, Vav-He, was considered so sacred that it was considered inappropriate for human beings to use it. Maybe an analogy would be, remember the West Wing, and you remember the chief of staff was Leo, and Leo and President Bartlett had been very close friends. It was Leo, really, who urged Governor Bartlett to run for president. And yet, once he becomes president, Leo never refers to his friend by his name, Jed. He always calls him Mr. President. The idea of somebody using the president's personal name, that's restricted to his spouse, right? That it would be considered disrespectful whether you like the current president or the previous one or any other one. It's always Mr. President. And it would be chutzpah to use his name. How dare you, right? He is above us on certain levels. So, or imagine a kid in, elementary school walking into the principal's office and calling the principal by his first name. You just don't do that, right? There's a sense of, there's separation, there's distance, and respect requires that kind of distance. So similarly, it was considered inappropriate, disrespectful, chutzpahdik, for human beings to refer to God by his personal name. You just don't do that. So instead, what did we do? Instead, we refer to God by a substitute. And that substitute was Adonai. And as I said, Adonai from Adon, Adon Olam, Lord, okay, Master. And Adonai literally means my Lord, my master, or our master. You may recall that on Yom Kippur, in the Musaf service, we have the Avoda prayer, and that's when you'll see the cantor go down, prostrate on the floor in front of the ark. And it's when we tell the story that on this day, and on this day alone, the Kohen Gadol, and only the Kohen Gadol, would actually go in to the temple and would utter the name of God. And when everybody heard it, everybody would hit the deck. They would all bow down, not bend at the waist. They would hit the floor, face to the floor. Because hearing the name of God, and not even the king was allowed to say this. Only one person, the Kohen Gadol. And saying the name of God, you were literally taking your life into your own hands. So this was a kind of a scary thing and an awe-inspiring thing to hear the name of God. Once the temple is destroyed, the name of God is never pronounced. Not on Yom Kippur, not by the Kohen Gadol, by nobody, never. So for 2,000 years, Jews do not pronounce that name. And yet, the name is there. You open up the Torah, it's there. You open up the Chumash, it's there. You open up the Siddur, the four-letter name of God, Yud He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton, is written. It's just never pronounced. Okay, so what are we supposed to do? You're reading the Torah and you see the four letters and you're not allowed to say them. So what do we say? So it's been the tradition that whenever we see those four letters, instead of pronouncing it, we simply say Adonai. That becomes the substitution, meaning my Lord. Now, here's the thing. Sometimes, remember, Adonai is a substitution for Yud He Vav He. Some people say, well, we're never going to say Yud He Vav He. And Adonai, which is the substitution, if I'm not actually praying, maybe I shouldn't even say that. So now we have a substitution for the substitution. And people will either say Hashem, which means the name, right? So if you were teaching children in a class about a prayer, you wouldn't say Baruch Atah Adonai, because you only are allowed to say that when you are praying, and we're not praying. So instead, you would always say Baruch Atah Hashem, right? And clearly we see that it is a substitution. I just saw Schindler's List was on the other day and watching it, and there's a scene in the factory where one of the 1,000 of the Schindler Jews is leading a Friday night service. And the guy has a magnificent cantorial voice, and he's got a traditional Eastern European accent for all of the words, and and in singing he says Baruch Atah Hashem. So clearly, whoever was behind that scene didn't want to offend Orthodox or other traditional Jews by using God's name in what isn't a real prayer. It was a performance made to look like it was a prayer. So we've got Hashem, and of course Orthodox Jews will always use Hashem, Baruch Hashem, blessed be God, all the time. Virtually, you won't hear them speak for more than a few minutes without Hasheming this or Hashem that. There's another shortcut for the four-letter name, and this is one you're very familiar with. This is two yuds, okay? And if you were to actually try to read this, because it has vowels, it's yi-yaw, but that's not a word. What is this? Well, this is a standard abbreviation for the name of God. How do they get that? Well, there's a couple interpretations. The real name of God, Yud-He-Vav-He, begins with a Yud. And the substitute name for God, Adonai, ends with a Yud. Right? So Yud-He-Vav-He beginning with a Yud, Adonai ending with a Yud. So some people explain that the two-letter abbreviation of God's name, Yud Yud, is taking the first and the last letters of those two words and sort of making it. Now you can't read this. It's not meant to be read. It's meant to be a sign. Say this as Adonai, and that's it, right? The end of the matter. There's another theory which is very interesting, which is that originally it was two yuds, but there was a sideways vav on top, a vav on its side, that originally was the abbreviation for God's name. What is that all about? Well, as you know, in Hebrew, letters have numerical values. Yud is 10. Two yuds is 20, right? And then a vav, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, vav, sixth letter of the alphabet. Vav is the number 6. So if you put together 6 plus two yuds, you come up with the number 26. Why is that significant? Because the gematria of Yud-He-Vav-He is 10 plus 5 plus 6 plus 5, and the numerical number or value or the gematria of Yud-He-Vav-He is 26. That becomes a sacred number in the Jewish system. So originally, two yuds and a vav was a way of abbreviating Yud-He-Vav-He. Problem was that printers couldn't easily make a sideways letter on top of the two yuds. So the vav got knocked out, and what was left was two yuds. That's another theory, where they came up with Yud Yud as an abbreviation for God. Okay, so here's the thing people want to know. Okay, how did people, I don't want to say it myself, but how did people used to pronounce the name of God? Well, all I can tell you is if you sound out the word, Yud, He, Vav, and a He, we're not really sure of the correct vowels, and that's a big problem. We know what the letters are, the consonants, but we don't know what the vowels are. If you were to sound it out, you would get something that sounds like the word Jehovah. That's what Jehovah's Witness is, what that name is all about. Jump in Jehovah, and then that became substitution, jump in Jehoshaphat. Jehovah is the Christian way of pronouncing Yud-He-Vav-He. Remember, in Hebrew, there are no J's. And very often, a Yud in English transliteration becomes a J. Like Yaakov becomes Jacob. Yosef becomes Joseph. Yud-He-Vav-He becomes Jehovah. So, to Christians, Jehovah is the name of God. Jews, we don't want to go there. We don't want to say his name. Not considered respectful or appropriate. So That's, the next thing we need to understand. Now, here we come to the issue. What do you do if this name is so sacred that we are not allowed to even pronounce it? Suppose it's in a book, and suppose the book is ruined. What are you going to do? Throw out the book with the name of God? Put it in the trash? You can't do it. So what do? We need to take care of it in a respectful way. The respectful way of dealing with any book that has the actual name of God in Hebrew, Yud He Vav He, in it. The respectful way is to put it in a geniza. Geniza literally means hidden away. And a geniza usually comes in two forms. One is we bury it. And it was considered, appropriate to take books. By the way, any book that has the name of God, Orthodox refer to these as shemos, from the word shem, meaning name. And it was considered appropriate to bury them. In fact, it's considered a great honor to bury books with a person. They would place the casket in the grave, and then on top of the casket, they might put a bag of prayer books or a chumash or things like that. And that was considered, a great honor to have that placed in a grave with a person. Or what we've done in the back of our parking lot on a couple of occasions is we've dug a hole and we've put boxes and boxes of books that either got ruined or were torn and can't be used anymore. We simply bury them. And they get the same respect that a human being would have. By the way, here's something very interesting. There are rules about respect towards the American flag. And if a flag gets destroyed or ruined, you can't just throw it in the trash. You need to dispose of it appropriately. And interestingly, the appropriate way of disposing of an American flag is to burn it. Now, not burning it, hippies in the 60s, burning it on the street. Getting a barrel and placing it in and, burning it as a kind of a ritual. This is sort of the opposite. It's the same intention, but the opposite end. For Jews, burning a body is considered, disrespectful. You bury a body. And in America, the idea is we need to deal with the flag respectfully. We do it by burning it. So we're on the same page, but in totally different ways of dealing with it. The other method of a geniza, besides burying it, is to set aside a room in which these books are collected and they are left there. The most famous geniza in history is the Cairo geniza. In Cairo, in Old Fostat, and there was a room above the synagogue, the Ezra synagogue, and there was an attic. And there they kept, for centuries, they kept old documents and books which were no longer, could be used. What happened is sometime in the 19th century, scholars discovered this, and this became one of the great treasures of Jewish history, because there were documents in there that went back 1,000 years, like a ketubah, right? And we now said, now we know what the text of a ketubah was in the year 900 or 1,000, right? Or there were legal documents. That's the most famous Cairo, and of course the discoverer, or not the discoverer, but the guy who was the main scholar of the Cairo Geniza was Solomon Schechter. And Solomon Schechter went on to become the president of the Jewish Theological Seminary. So that we have there. And now one more thing I wanted to talk about. Many people are under the assumption that when you write the name of God, you have to write G-D. And Orthodox people will only do it that way. But here's the idea. First of all, G-O-D is not God's name. It's his job, right? That's number one. So that's not holy. Number two, it's in English. So if you ask me, there's really no reason whatsoever to write G-D in English. There's no problem in writing G-O-D and then in taking that piece of paper and throwing it in the trash. What are you supposed to do with if you have a Xerox that has the name of God on it? It's not really a Siddur. Do you need to bury that in a Geniza? Well, Orthodox Jews will tell you if you have a Xerox that has Yud-Hey Vav-Hey on it, that needs to go into the Geniza, either into the ground or into that attic. But the conservative movement, the Committee on Law and Standards, has said that if we're dealing with Xerox, right, not an actual printed book, that it is more eco-friendly and more respectful to God to recycle that. In other words, take those pages, Xerox pages with God's name, and set them aside. In other words, don't throw them in with, Sunday's Newsday. But set it aside, perhaps put it in a bag, but you are able then to recycle that. Those Xerox pages. Anything that's from an actual book needs to go into the Geniza. So I think we've covered most of the points here. So let's move on to our second question. And this was a fascinating one. Questioner said, there are many Jews who will not listen to the music of Richard Wagner due to his well-deserved reputation of being an anti-Semite. Just as there are Jews who would never own a German car, there are those of us who have chosen to boycott Wagner's music. While there is nothing glaringly anti-Semitic about his music, he is on record as making many Jew-hating statements, writings, and so on. Likewise, there are performers and conductors who achieved great success under the Nazi regime, and while their tenure extended well past its demise, their recordings are often avoided by many Jewish and non-Jewish music lovers who saw them as owing their careers and their loyalty to the National Socialist Party. My question is, what does Jewish teaching say about boycotting the creations, artistic and physical, of a person who has performed or inspired evil acts? Do we write these composers, performers, actors, and writers off, or do we separate their work from their philosophy? So fascinating. So first of all, you should know that no less a person than Theodor Herzl was an incredibly big fan of Wagner, number one. Number two, in 1936, the Palestine Orchestra, Palestine, of course, referring to pre-State of Israel, in the land of Israel, the Jewish community. And the Jews, many of whom, by the way, were refugees from Germany, and they came to Palestine, and they became part of the Palestine Orchestra. In its opening years, 1936, 1937, they did play several works by Wagner. But after Kristallnacht in 1938, they said, he's off. That's the end of him. And there was a kind of a boycott. by the orchestra of any of his works. And that was the way it was. In 1981, Zubin Mehta, who was a guest conductor of the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra, which succeeded the Palestine Orchestra, did an encore at one of his concerts. And he felt, look, I get it. I understand where we are. I understand who the audience is in Israel. But how can you be a serious music student and lover and ignore Wagner? So what did Zubin Mehta do, who, by the way, is Indian, not a Jew, but as close to Israel and the Jewish people as anybody could possibly be? Zubin Mehta, after the performance, people were cheering, encore, encore. And he said, okay, we're going to do an encore, but I need to warn the audience that I'm going to play Wagner, a piece from Wagner. So if you're offended, now would be a good time to leave. You know, for those of you who have a subscription and you paid tickets and you heard the concert, okay, you can leave now and you haven't been cheated. But I don't want to offend anybody, and if you're going to be offended, you can leave now. Well, that didn't go over well in Israel. A big stink was made, and nothing happened until 1992 when Daniel Barenboim said, I'm going to break this, and he put together a program, not an encore, but the actual program, but there was such an outrage and an uproar that he had to cancel that program. Finally, I think in 2000, it was finally done, but there continued to be protests. So the question is, how long, are we supposed to hold this grudge? And how long are we supposed to take this? I got to tell you that back in the 70s, one of the things that stunned me when I was in Israel for the first time is to see all the taxi cabs that were driving around, and at the time they were all Mercedes. And I said, I don't get it. I was brought up in a family that, who swore, we don't drive German cars. We just don't do that. It's our way of holding a grudge, of remembering, maybe taking revenge, showing respect to the 6 million. Forget it. So our family in America wouldn't dare buy a German car. And yet, in Israel, you got tens of thousands of Mercedes driving around. What's going on here? Well, this goes back to the fact that in 1952, the state of Israel made an agreement with West Germany for reparations. Not for, look, both sides were in desperate need. Israel, under David Ben-Gurion, was desperate for money. The economy was failing. Who knew if Israel was even a viable state? Germany in 1952 was desperate for being welcomed back into the, into the goodwill of nations. How are you going to do this? Perhaps by supporting Israel. Now, this was not, we're going to pay you money for the 6 million people we killed. It was worded in the sense of, we understand that the state of Israel had to spend billions of dollars to resettle refugees who were refugees because of the Second World War, which was our fault. Therefore, we will help the state of Israel. Now, both sides benefited. Germany, it was considered a decent thing to do, and it was their way of making atonement, in a sense, in a small way. And Israel was desperate for the money. Now, you should know that at the time, the leader of the opposition, this is 1952, the leader of the opposition in Israel to David Ben-Gurion, who was prime minister, was Menachem Begin. And Begin's family had all been killed, by the Nazis. And Begin got up and gave a speech, a very, fiery speech. And he said, "We will not let this stand." And he spoke and he said, "You can't pay us for the 6 million that you have murdered. This is an outrage." And to accept money from Germany is to spit on the ashes of all those 6 million. And in fact, Begin basically was ready to lead a civil war. And in fact, there was a protest which led to a riot, and there was a march on the Knesset, and you had the police had to be called out, and there was tear gas, and it looked at that moment as if Israel perhaps would be engaged in a civil war over this issue of reparations. And Begin's idea was, we will never make peace, ever, with Germany. This is the devil. This is the enemy. Well, you can ask the question, okay, we get it for people who were alive during the Shoah, during the Holocaust, but what about their children or their grandchildren? How long do you continue this? And, ultimately, when Begin becomes prime minister, relations with West Germany are, a normal part of, the politics of the time. So, here, and then we can raise, a number of other questions. It's not a matter just of Wagner's music or of German cars, but even in America, what about a Ford, right? If you're going to take the attitude that Mercedes or a BMW, are German companies and in fact exploited Jewish slave labor during the Holocaust. So those cars are, that's treif to us. You could make a case that Henry Ford was one of the great anti-Semites, and he encouraged, in the Dearborn Independent, and spoke out against the Jews very often. So, do we hold a grudge against buying a Ford, right? Ultimately, you have to ask yourself, where does all of this end in terms of issues of the person behind it and the product that they create? Are the two one and the same, or are we able to separate? Let's talk about another, another step. Think about food, for instance, and I know I'm going 2 steps different, but it's still a fascinating mind experiment. We know that there are halachic concepts of what constitutes kosher, but then there are ethical standards that are not included in the Torah. So for instance, it used to be standard operating procedure in slaughterhouses, including kosher slaughterhouses, that when you were slaughtering an animal, they had a procedure called hoisting and shackling. You put a cuff on the animal's back leg attached to a chain, and the chain, pulls the animal upside down, hanging by one leg from the ceiling, and then the shochet comes in with the animal's neck right in front of him and simply performs the act of shchita, of cutting the animal's neck, which is probably a lot easier than trying to wrestle a cow that is in front of you, and getting to its neck without it moving. There's nothing in the Torah that says hoisting and shackling is forbidden. And yet it's clear that this was torturing an animal, to hang it upside down by one leg from a chain. Or the idea of veal. Veal technically is kosher if it's slaughtered in the kosher procedure. But in order to create veal, you basically place a young animal in a cage so that it never moves, never runs, and ultimately that creates a different quality of meat. But in doing so, you're torturing the animal. So among the Orthodox, they say, well, what does the Torah say? Torah doesn't say anything about veal or torturing an animal or hoisting and shackling it. So therefore, there's no problem. It was the conservative movement which really said, you know what, it's not just the letter of the law, it's the spirit of the law that counts as well. And so there was a movement 10, 15 years ago called Hechsher Tzedek. Hechsher meaning the sign that shows that this is approved, this is appropriate, this is kosher. Tzedek meaning righteous. So Hechsher Tzedek, the idea was that this would only be given, within the kosher world. Hechsher Tzedek, you've got your OU, which says it's kosher. But if you also had the Hechsher Tzedek sign, it would say that this meat has been raised in accordance with ethical standards as well. And not only concerning the animal, but concerning the workers, that the plant does not exploit the laborers who work in these slaughterhouses. As you can imagine, it didn't go very far, because the Orthodox and the OU have a monopoly, and they weren't going to stand for it. And frankly, how many, the kosher, the people who keep kosher are more interested in, most of them are Orthodox, and most of them are only interested, does it have an OU on it or doesn't it? And if it had the second thing, people would say, why do I care? And how many conservative Jews said, yes, this is an issue? How many conservative Jews keep kosher? And how many, is it worth it for the slaughterhouse to have a second, hashgacha on the package? So again, what's the letter of the law? What's the spirit of the law? And again, this is a step or two removed from Wagner, but the music is among the most beautiful in the world. But the guy's a vicious anti-Semite. Hitler read his writings. Hitler was influenced by Wagner. What are you supposed to do? And here's a couple of other issues as well. Black Lives Matter. I think most Jews would probably say, yes, we are in sympathy with the idea that it's just wrong what's happening to too many black people, and to protest and to say Black Lives Matter. Okay, except that the Black Lives Matter organization put out a manifesto which included, believe it or not, a foreign policy. And part of their foreign policy was that we condemn Israel for their persecution of the Palestinians. What? What does that got to do with policemen kneeling on the neck of a black man in Minnesota? But for whatever reason, the people who were initially behind the Black Lives Matter movement went to that further step. They couldn't help themselves. Their hatred of Jews was such that, it's not just about people of color in America, it's about Palestinians as well. And we are in solidarity with our Palestinian brothers who are living under apartheid and persecution. So what is a Jew supposed to do who believes that, yes, we need to protest, but can I do that under the banner of Black Lives Matter if I know that Black Lives Matter has another agenda which violates everything that I believe in terms of Israel? Or what are you supposed to do when there's a women's march in Washington and we find out that one of the organizers of the Women's March is, again, an anti-Semite, and part of her agenda is, bringing disrepute upon Israel? Or back to the issue of art, what are we supposed to do, for instance, with Roger Waters, the rock star from Pink Floyd, who was among the leading supporters of the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanction of Israel. And, a great deal of his energy is in trying to discredit and hurt the state of Israel. What do you do with an author like Alice Walker, The Color Purple, right? Who, again, has made a number of anti-Semitic and anti-Israel statements. What do you do with the painter Degas, a known anti-Semite? What do you do with T.S. Eliot and with Ezra Pound, poets who were anti-Semites and incredible in their hatred of the Jewish people? And there, it's not even a matter of disagreeing with Israel's foreign policy, just hating Jews. Okay, so what's the answer to all of these dilemmas? So, well, I can't tell you that God says you shouldn't listen to Wagner. I can tell you that the Torah says Wagner is treif and you shouldn't have anything to do with it. All I could tell you is that it's a continuing issue and a continuing problem, and I share with you this incredible teaching from the Talmud. This is from Chagiga. Rava explained, Babylonian teacher, 3rd century. What was the meaning of the verse? I went down to the grove of nuts to see the budding in the valley. This is from the book of Song of Songs. Why are scholars compared to a nut? Right? Imagine a walnut. And there's this rabbinic teaching that scholars, rabbis, are sort of like walnuts. Why? Where'd that come from? To tell you that just as the nut is dirtied by mud and filth, yet its contents are not spoiled, so too scholars, even though they have sinned, their Torah remains unspoiled. So the nut falls from the tree and it's in the mud, but you know what? You could wipe it down, wash it off, and what's inside the shell still remains good, even though the outside has become filthy. Okay, listen to this. Rabbah bar Shelah, another Babylonian rabbi, met Elijah the prophet. Whoa! He runs into Elijah the prophet. Now, really? Or it's a story? More likely the latter. He said to him, "Tell me, you're up with God, you're friends with him. What does God do all day?" Right? He said, "God is uttering traditions in the name of all the rabbis." You want to know what God does all day? He's studying Gemara up in heaven. And he's saying, and Rabbi Akiva said this, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said that. But traditions in the name of Rabbi Meir, God does not utter. In other words, of all the rabbis, there were dozens of them. God uses all of their traditions, he repeats them, but God boycotts Rabbi Meir. Rabbah says to Elijah the prophet, why not? What's God got against Rabbi Meir? Rabbi Meir was a student of Rabbi Akiva because he learned the tradition from Acher. The main teacher of Rabbi Meir was Elisha ben Abuya. Elisha ben Abuya became an apostate. He left the Jewish people. He became a collaborator with the Romans. He went over to the dark side and the other side, and he turned in Jews. There's a very famous story why he did this. He once saw a young boy fall from a tree and die, following his father's instruction to shoo away the mother bird when taking the eggs, both of which laws: listen to your father, don't take the eggs while the mother bird is there, say that if you do these mitzvot, you will live a long, long life. Elisha ben Abuya saw the student obey those commandments in the Torah, fall from the tree and die. So he became an apostate. So what happened? Rabbah questions God. He said, I think God is making a big mistake by boycotting Rabbi Meir, because whatever Rabbi Meir learned, most of it he got from his teacher. It's not that Rabbi Meir was an apostate, his teacher was an apostate. And so we could question, maybe he taught Rabbi Meir some things which aren't so right. So God not only got rid of Elisha ben Abuya, he got rid of Elisha ben Abuya's main student, Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir, so Rabbah says, I think God is making a big mistake. Why? Rabbi Meir found a pomegranate. The inside he ate, its peel he threw away. Think about a pomegranate, right? Unlike an apple, which you can just bite and basically eat the whole thing, you can't eat the outside of a pomegranate. It's worthless. What you have to do, of course, is you open it, you dig out the seeds, which are filled with, juice and are taste wonderful, but you throw away the outside, you keep the inside. And this is brilliant. Rabbi Meir, he may have learned from a bad guy, but you know what? Rabbi Meir still had worthy things to teach us. Therefore, what we do is we listen, we look, we learn all the things he taught. The bad things, if there are any bad things that seem to have come from Elisha ben Abuya, those we discard. But the good things that Rabbi Meir learned and taught, we should embrace. You don't throw Rabbi Meir out with all his worthy teachings. Now think about this. Here we have two different opinions. One opinion is God. God is basically saying, I don't want to hear from Wagner. He's no damn good. He's an anti-Semite. Ban him. Don't listen to him. Boycott him. Forget about him. On the other hand, you've got Rabbah, who basically says, God, I disagree with you. I say we keep the good things that Rabbi Meir taught. We throw away what's bad. And so I think Rabbah would make the case that Wagner, yes, know who the guy is and, know what he was and who he influenced, but ultimately, you don't want to read his essays about Jews and music, which influenced Hitler, but you can listen to his operas and his music because there's beauty there. Now, is this teaching in the Talmud resolved? I mean, on the one hand, it's God versus some guy we never heard of, Rabbah bar Shela. You'd think God would win out, which says, forget about Wagner. But on the other hand, when they edited this teaching, they said, God says this, but we end with, here's what Rabbah says. You can listen to the music as long as you separate it from the creator. That seems to indicate that the second opinion of Rabbah, that Rabbi Meir, we hold on to the good stuff, is worthwhile, and we hold on to. So the long way, the short answer is ultimately, I can't tell you that Judaism says it's forbidden for Jews to listen to Wagner. In Israel, it's what the audience will put up with. And clearly, for a long, long time, the audience in Israel, often made up of Holocaust survivors, said, we ain't going to stand for this. As time goes on, maybe that will change over the course of time. And is it treif for a Jew to listen to and appreciate Wagner? Rabbah would say no, but you should still know who the guy is. And you should separate the man from his work. But for those who say, forget about it, I don't want to know from him, you know what? No less a personage than God himself felt that way.